Hi, and welcome to the flow along video. What we're going to do is we're going to use the video you watched, the debate you watched for the practice flow, and we're going to flow together. So we will watch a little bit of the video, then I'll show you what I have, and then we'll continue to do that. We're not going to watch the whole speeches because that would take too long, and we'll probably stop after the 1AR because it's back and forth. After that it's just rinse and repeat, change colors. So to start, remember, for LD debate you need 2 sheets of paper. The first sheet needs to have 5 columns. As you can see, I have them labeled. Then the next sheet needs to have 4 columns. Again, you can see I have them labeled. So we're going to listen to the 1AC, which means we start on the affirmative sheet of paper, the one that is the only sheet that has the letters AC for affirmative constructive listed. So everything that is read in that first speech is going to go in this very first column. Okay, so let's start and see what happens.
I submit that if an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him or her is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, that individual is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. It's because I agree with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. I affirm the resolution that civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified. I have one definition. According to Professor Michael Walzer in his book Obligations, civil disobedience is a non-revolutionary encounter with the state, in which a person breaks the law but does so in ways which do not challenge the legitimacy of the legal or political system. This person feels morally bound to disobey, but also recognizes the moral value of the state. Civil disobedience is a way of maneuvering between these conflicting moralities. Disobedience willingly accepts punishment, which is a key distinguishing factor between disobedience and other forms of crime like vandalism, which are intended to remain anonymous. The highest value for this debate is morality, since the resolution questions whether civil disobedience can be justified on moral grounds. Democracies trust individuals to make moral decisions, so the criterion for morality is individual conscience.
Okay, he starts out, and I'm just hiding because I have a little bit of extra pre-flowing done, so I'm just going to show you here. So he starts out with his observation, where he says that as long as we break the law and we accept that punishment, then we are respecting the law, and so it's fine. Then he goes into a definition. There is where he says, here's what civil disobedience is. If you remember from the first video on flowing, I tell you, whenever you have a common phrase you know is going to be coming up and over, make sure that you shorten it. So mine is shortened down to just civil disobedience will always just be CD. I use the equal sign, as you can see. And that just means equals, creates, synonymous to, just, this is what happens. Anything like that? And you define that civil disobedience is non-revolutionary. We still respect the laws of the state. And we willingly accept whatever the state doles out as punishment. Then he says, here's my value. He says it's morality, because that is what the resolution is asking us. And then he says my value criterion is individual consciousness. And he'll get into that definition when we hit play again. The big things to take away is, look how I really shorten. They say a lot of words. I don't really write that much. But I know exactly what they said. Next, I'm leaving this vertical space. This is what you're expected to do. So when I say leave vertical space, this is what I mean. Right? That way, if the negative decides to make an argument against me or against the other person, I, on my flow, have plenty of room to write whatever that argument is wherever it goes. Okay, so let's see what he's going to say for his value contention or his value criterion definition, and then goes into his contention 1 and see what contention 1 is. And then I will see you back here.
As political philosopher John Rawls writes in A Theory of Justice, even though people normally seek advice and counsel and accept the injunctions of those in authority when these seem reasonable to them, they are always accountable for their deed. We cannot divest ourselves of our responsibility and transfer the burden of blame to others. My first contention is that what is legal is not what is moral. Laws can and have been grossly immoral throughout history, best illustrated with the help of the 1927 Supreme Court decision Buck versus Bell. The state of Virginia was attempting to forcibly sterilize Mrs. Carrie Bell, an institutionalized inmate in a state facility. Mrs. Bell sued to prevent the operation. On an 8-1 decision, the court struck down the legal challenge. The majority opinion read, quote, "The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Denying the legitimacy of civil disobedience would mean not only that Mrs. Bell would be unjustified in attempting to resist this most inhumane of procedures, but that a doctor ought simply perform his duty and would in fact be remiss if he objected on principle. John Rawls, previously cited, agrees that in a democracy, law is not the ultimate moral arbiter. If the sovereign is held to govern by divine right as God's chosen lieutenant, then his subjects have only the rights of suppliants. They can plead their cause, but they cannot disobey should their appeal be denied. To do this would be to rebel against the final legitimate moral and not simply legal authority. But once society is interpreted as a scheme of cooperation among equals, those injured by serious injustices need not submit. By resisting injustice within the limits of fidelity to law, civil disobedience serves to inhibit departures from justice and correct them when they do occur. My second...
All right, so value criterion and contention 1. Let's look at what he said. So, he says value criterion is individual consciousness. He describes that as we are accountable for our own deeds. We can't blame others. We have to take responsibility for what we do. Comes from John Rawls, not a problem. Next, he says his contention 1 is if it's legal does not always mean it's moral. So I just have legal, not does not equal sign, im. Im always means moral in this debate for me. And I say, I have flowed that in history, laws have been in existence that were immoral. He cites Buck v. Bell, which was about forced sterilization, he says. Then I run out of room. I'm at the end of my paper, but he keeps talking, so I take it and I flip it. I don't flip it this way. I flip it from the bottom comes the top. That way I'm in the same column area. And I've written here what he said, which is in a democracy, the law is not the moral arbiter, meaning it's not the end-all be-all of what is or is not moral, and we should not consider it to be that. And then he says, now my contention 2. So let's listen and see what that is.
Contention is that civil disobedience functions as a reciprocal check against society. I argue there are 2 truths fundamental to a democratic conception of the individual moral agent. The first truth is that citizens can't use the law to shirk their own moral responsibility. Throughout history, the claim, "I was just following orders," has been used to justify a wide variety of atrocities. But citizens can't ignore their conscience simply because the law says otherwise. The second truth is that law cannot be used to force individuals to suffer under oppression. Democratic respect for the individual entails a corresponding individual claim to resist outside domination.
Okay. So, contention 2. He says, it's a check on society. As you see, I just have check mark on SOS. He says there's 2 truths to individual morality. The first is that we can't shirk our own individual moral responsibility. The second is that the law cannot force oppression in a democracy because we have to avoid domination. That's all I got. Basically what he says. Now he's going to go on. He's going to say more. It's a 6-minute speech. It's a lot longer. but we're going to skip ahead to what the negative says. So when the negative starts speaking, we are going to start on the 4-column sheet, known as the negative sheet. Okay? And observation through his contentions will be on this sheet of paper right in here. Then, when he says, now on to the affirmative, or next to the affirmative, whatever his little key phrase is, we go back to the 5-column sheet of paper. We're still in the same speech. We're still in the negative constructive, but we're in this second column. And so we're going to look for what did the affirmative say, and we're going to write down what he says in response right next to the affirmative in the NC column. Okay? So I'm going to let this video play through the entire NC, and then we'll come back and talk about that flow for the NC before we move on to the affirmative arguments. So you need to make sure that you're switching colors along with switching sheets of paper right now, and I'll be back.
With that, now let's turn to the negative. While the affirmative may make civil disobedience sound like a wonderful way to promote change, he never explains why change means one person should have more power than everyone else. Because civil disobedience fails to respect other people's rights to have a say in democracy, I negate. The resolution asks whether civil disobedience is justified, so the value ought to be justice, defined as giving each his or her due. Specifically, justice in a democracy means giving each citizen his or her due in terms of political power and expression. Henry Mayo clarifies how democracy does this in an introduction to democratic theory. Democracy is unique in recognizing the political expression of conflicting interests and opinions as legitimate. Democracy provides for the peaceful adjustment of disputes, the maintenance of order, and the working out of public policies by means of its compromise function. The benefit of this compromise is that all interests and opinions are expressed and weighed fairly when no one can agree, rather than one person's interest dominating the rest. Therefore, the criterion for justice is fair consideration of interests. Ethicist Peter Singer writes, "The decision procedure in which all members have equal say in decisions and then accept the result is a paradigm of fair consideration. It is beneficial since a peaceful settlement of disputes is better than settlement by force, and it is just because it evaluates each interest fairly." My contention is that civil disobedience denies fair consideration of interests by asserting the power of one person over the rest of society and legitimizing the use of coercion to resolve disagreements. Civil disobedience, editor Dwight Murphy notes, is exquisitely embroidered with love and goodwill, but stripped to its essentials, it is the concept that every man can be his own judge and jury and legislator, that a minority has the right to flout the law, to force its will upon society. Breaking the law, unlike free speech or legal protests, unjustly limits the rights of others by undermining the role they had in making that law in the first place. There's no point to voting for the stance you want if someone can just override your vote at any time by refusing to obey the authority of the vote's result. Singer explains, in claiming that his own judgment entitles him to a greater say in the matter than the others, the dissenter is making a claim which the others could make, and which, if many of them did make, would be incompatible with a peaceful decision procedure. Due to the impossibility of reaching agreement, it would be best if everyone accepted compromise instead of acting on their own individual judgments. A society in which everyone acted on individual judgments would legitimize use of coercion to solve disagreements. Civil disobedience upsets legal avenues for social change, like public forums, where disagreements can coexist. Instead, it turns disagreement into conflict. When your spoken argument is made useless by the direct action of others, the only way to defend your beliefs is with retaliatory action. For example, if a racist restaurant owner decides to civilly disobey an equal rights protection law by kicking a black man out of his shop, the only way that man can get to eat inside the restaurant is if he forces his way in. Far from giving the minority a check against the majority, civil disobedience overrides checks that already exist in the law, turning disagreement into a battle of might is right, where the strongest group wins. Supreme Court Justice Charles Whittaker writes, minority groups, in preaching and practicing defiance of the law, are in fact advocating erosion and destruction of the only structure that can permanently maintain due process and the equal protection of the laws, and thereby protect them from discriminations and abuses. The key reason why democracy works is that people can express their beliefs in legal ways, such as public forums, voting, or legal protests, but refrain from acting on those beliefs in favor of peace and fairness. Civil disobedience destroys both, and that's why we negate. Now let's turn to the affirmative side.
Okay, so how'd you do? Hopefully better than when you did the practice debate, or the practice flow. So let's go over what he said and how I have it flowed on mine. So, to start off with, starting up at the top, he says in the 1NC, all right, well, the AF makes it look like it's awesome, but it's not because it's putting more power in the hands of one than in everyone, right? So, more power for one. Next, he says, therefore, the value should be justice. And he says, justice means each gets their due. That in a democracy, that political power and expression ought to be equal. That there can be peaceful adjustments that are made. And that all experiences must be fair. Or expressions must be fair. Excuse me. Then he goes to his value criterion. His value criterion is fair consideration of interests, where he quotes Peter Singer. Peter says that we are all equal. Let me read. Oh, that in decision making we need to all be equal. And in a democracy, justice occurs because of things that are fair. Then he goes into his contention, which I have, there we go, where he says that civil disobedience denies the power of one for the others, that we become our own judge, jury, and legislator, that it's unjustly limiting rights of others, that we don't compromise, therefore there's no individual justice. And then I run out at the bottom, so I flip from the bottom up to the top, and I write the next thing from Judge Whitaker, where he talks about how when minorities use civil disobedience, they actually are destroying the law that protects them. That's the 1NC in a nutshell. We're done with this sheet of paper for now. So he said the key words. Therefore, let's move to the affirmative side. This means we stick with the same color of pen. We're still whatever color pen we were using for the affirmative, but we're going back to that 5-column sheet of paper. We're going to be flowing in the NC column, okay? He's going to say what he's talking about. You need to find those arguments on the flow and write next to it. So I'm going to let it play and then come back and then vice versa. So see you in just a second.
He gives you this value of morality and a value criterion of individual conscience. Put them together because basically he defines morality as what the individual likes. However, while it's easy for my opponent to justify disobedience by looking at the problem through the eyes of one person at a time, it would be easy for it to be moral, because then I would do whatever I think is right. However, the resolution is about individuals in the context of a democracy, which is a society containing multiple people. Therefore, the only way to universally justify the resolution as a general principle is by affirming for all people at the same time collectively. In other words, disobedience must be justified for everyone in a democracy. Now, if everyone has absolute moral authority and absolute individual conscience, as he claims, then rights will always conflict, and then none will matter. But law limits absolute rights so everyone can enjoy them, at least partially. Because multiple people have equal rights, the only way to maximize them for an entire society as one is to have obligations that consider others as well as yourself. He basically admits this in cross-examination, where he tells you that even if your individual conscience tells you to harm other people, you can't do that, because you have to consider your moral obligations to other people before you consider your moral obligations to do whatever you think is right. At that point, you can't look towards this absolute value of morality with a criterion of individual conscience, because everyone has their own conception of morality. That's why you look towards the value of justice, to make sure that everyone has their due in expressing their own moral beliefs and their own individual conscience. And you look towards the criterion of fair consideration of interest, because that criterion prioritizes your moral obligations to other people over your moral obligations to follow your own conscience. Go to his contention.
Okay, so first big argument point was in regards to the affirmative value and value criterion. So let's look at that now. So he says to put them together. So that's why I draw this line. In my head, this means these two arguments are now connected as one in the debate. You don't have to do that. I'm just saying that's what I do for my brain. Then I write all the arguments that he makes. And as you can see, there's quite a few. So he says that the resolution says we have to look at the issue inside of a democracy. And in a democracy, there's not just one person, there's a bunch. Which means that not just one person can ever have absolute moral authority. Because if that happens, rights are going to start conflicting a lot. And they're not going to matter at that point. And in a democracy, the point is to maximize rights for everybody. And that because of that, we need to consider others before we consider ourselves. Then, in his rebuttaling, he starts to say which person is more important, the af or the neg. And he says that we need to put the negative value and value criterion first because it's what allows for us to consider others before we take action. Because if we consider our own selves, we'll only act for us and no one else. Okay? So that's what he said. He said a whole bunch of words. They boil down to that. All right, now he said on to contention 1. So you're going to find contention 1 on the flow, right, which was about laws not being moral, and write down what does he say there? What is his argument really here, right? So as you can see, we're lining the arguments up with where they go. All right, let's see what he says.
One now. He talks about how laws can be immoral. However, the individual can be immoral as well. He still hasn't proven any sort of definite benefit to the affirmative side in terms of morality. The problem is he talks about all these inhumane procedures, but the problem is that the law could just as well be protecting rights. I gave you the example of the Equal Rights Protection Law and make sure that whites and blacks can eat together in a restaurant. But people can civilly disobey that on an individual level because racists might think that it's right to be racist. At that point, he can't even achieve morality because there's this problem of basically people can be wackos. Okay, turn to his contention 2 now.
Okay, so we're gonna stop here, but let's go over what he just said. So, he said, ooh, bendy paper. He said that just like laws, individuals can make immoral decisions and be immoral, and that just like individuals, laws can also be there to protect the rights. And so, because some people aren't considered moral in their actions all the time, we can't trust them. Simple enough. All right, so now we're going to skip ahead to the affirmative. Now, your job here is to figure out, does he start on the negative sheet or the affirmative sheet? He'll say, you know, what he's talking about first. Find it and start writing his argument next to that. I'm not going to tell you where he starts. I want to see if you can figure it out. So I'm going to let him go for a while. Then I will come back and I will show you where he was, where you should have started, and see how you're doing. So I'll be right back.
In his last speech, the negative tells you that we need to have fair consideration of the interests of individuals. And then in cross-examination, although it was a little bit hard to hear, we set up 4 planks that I need to meet in order to meet his standard. So the first is that it's nonviolent. Remember, that's fine. I tell you, civil disobedience doesn't encompass violence because it's a non-revolutionary encounter with the state. And since the state is the organism in society that has a monopoly on legitimate violence, civil disobedience precludes any sort of violent action. That's the first plank. The second plank is that it's universal, that everyone should be able to do it. That's fine. I grant that some people might use civil disobedience in ways we don't like. The governor of Alabama might try and stop blacks from entering schools after desegregation orders have been filed. I'll grant that. My argument, though, is that society has reciprocal checks to prevent that, so the National Guard gets sent in and actually allows those students to go forth. So it's universal, second plank. The third argument is that I still respect authority. Remember, civil disobedience takes place still recognizing the legitimate authority of the state. A civil disobedient is punished. The reason we have laws to say if you break such and such a statute, you will be hit with such and such a penalty. The person who does that through civil disobedience accepts the ability of the law to punish, i.e., they accept the authority of the majority to pass whatever laws they want. Civil disobedience is just another avenue for the minority to amplify their voices and get them into society. So the fourth argument and the fourth plank that I meet is that we're still using democratic processes. Remember, civil disobedience still go through the courts. They still try and persuade the majority. At that point, you're still respecting everyone. So look to his criterion of fair consideration of interests. Fine, it's completely fair. The individual who commits civil disobedience isn't saying that they're any better than anyone else or that the law ought not apply to them. They're just saying that they choose to accept the consequences of breaking a law.
Okay, so where did you start? Hopefully, you started on the negative sheet of paper, 4-column sheet, in the 1AR, because that's the speech we're in, and you started flowing down by the value criterion. So, he said on the value criterion we have 4 planks. Here's how I meet all 4 planks. And so I have all 4 planks and how he meets them. Now, as you can see, this is why we leave vertical room. I am all just starting to mix in with contention 1. I don't like that. For me, that's like, oh no. And I even started, if you look, a little bit above. So this is why we leave the vertical space, so that things don't get messy. Okay? This is a great example where the negative says one argument, not very long, but the response to it is really long. So we need all that extra space. So hopefully that clarifies 2 things. 1, why you leave vertical space, and 2, why we use 8.5 by 14 paper. Not 8.5 by 11, 8.5 by 14. Remember, you can get this by the individual sheet from any print department in any store that you can go to, such as Office Depot. So make sure you get that. It is worth points. If you use the wrong paper, going the wrong direction, if you try to flow like this instead of like this, I'm taking points off for these next flows that you do during next week as some quizzes. So pay attention, make sure you're getting this. All right, let's see where he goes next. See if you can keep up with him.
Look to the first contention then, where he says that civil disobedience asserts the power of one member over society. Remember, that's completely untrue. Civil disobedience is just one part of an integral mechanism between society and the individual. It doesn't say the individual is better than society or outside society's laws. It says that the individual will, for a moral reason, choose to break a law and accept punishment. Then he gives you a Singer card saying that everyone should compromise because if everyone was disobedient, there would be chaos. Well, remember, if everyone filed a civil suit in court, then the courts would be clogged and shut down. And if everyone wanted to hold an assembly under their rights guaranteed in the First Amendment, then no one would be available to go to assemblies, and no one would go. So the fact that everyone would do, the fact that if everyone would do something, it would destroy the process, isn't a reason to reject civil disobedience any more than it is a reason to reject civil suits. The next argument he gives you is that racists might kick blacks out of a restaurant and they have to force their way back in.
Okay. So he said, on contention 1, here are my arguments. So you should have moved down to contention 1 and written his arguments. The first is that this argument that everyone, that one is above the other is untrue. And then the second is that just because everyone might do it is not a reason for not doing it. That makes no logical sense. Then he's going to go on and talk, okay? So we're going to skip ahead until he says and starts talking about himself. So we're going to let him, you're going to flow himself. Now remember, when you're talking about the affirmative argument, you're on the 5-column sheet of paper, which means that we need to be in the still 1AR column because that's still the same speech that we're in. So let's see what he says about himself.
So look to the affirmative side of the flow. His argument is that we look to the conscience of democracy, and you have to respect all people. You have obligations to consider others. Completely fine. I admit that in the definition of what civil disobedience means. Then he tells you the individual can be immoral. My argument is the state can be immoral too. So we should allow the individual moral conscience to act as a check upon society within the limits I prescribe in my definition. His next argument is, again, he repeats the racist argument. Remember, my argument is it's a reciprocal check law fixes. What Rawls then tells you is that in a democracy, the sovereign isn't the final moral authority. This is pretty important. It says that the law doesn't have inherent moral value, so there's no moral obligation to obey it. The second contention then says that civil disobedience is a check. He tells you laws can stop oppression. I say civil disobedience is another avenue. He says we have to work within the system. That's fine. I'm still accepting the system. Remember, civil disobedience uses the democratic process as a way to effect great change. And then he tells you that we're not looking at motives. That's fine. I'm saying it's always a good thing to be faithful to your own moral conscience within limits. So as long as an individual has fidelity to their own moral compass, that's a moral thing regardless of the motive.
Okay, so let's see what he said in defense of himself. So he said, now on to the affirmative, which means I go back to that 5-column sheet of paper, or 5-column sheet of paper. And I'm in the 3rd column. So he says, all right, so my opponent says that everybody has to be equal, we have to treat everyone equal, and we have to recognize the state. He goes, great. I agree with you. That's awesome. Yes, we need to do that. And my civil disobedience definition says, yep, that's what we're doing. So he's like, good job. You are making an argument I'm making. Then he comes down and he's like, all right, let's look at the negative argument where they say the individual can be immoral too. And he's like, exactly. So can the state, which is why we have to have a check. That check against the state is the individual. Just like the state is a check on the individual. It's a reciprocal relationship. Then he says, okay, now let me remind you of the other things I said that my opponent didn't say anything to. So we look. And he says, remember, Singer says the sovereign cannot be the moral authority. And as you can see, I just draw a line that says, all right, he is repeating this argument in his next speech. It's called extending into my next speech. Then he says, also remember that we have to be a check on society. Now, what we didn't see was the negative saying, well, that's why we have courts and everything to check these. You can go to court and stuff. And the affirmative is saying, yeah, sure, fine, you can go to court. But civil disobedience is another way to make a check against problems. It's another way to act. It gives us more options, which is always good. Okay, we're going to stop there because then it's just going to go, the negative's going to say, oh, I'm great. The affirmative's going to say, oh, I'm great. And that's going to be the end of the debate. Hopefully this helps. If this does not help you and you are still confused, come see me in my office. Send me an email, whatever you need to do to get the basics of flowing understood for you. So, a couple of things to remember. When you do a debate, when you're actually doing the debate with me, you need to pre-flow, which is on the syllabus. It says that you pre-flowed. So what that means is, if you're the affirmative, this first column is pre-filled out in flow form. So in shorthand flow form with the big breaks. You know what you're going to say. You're writing the script. Put it on the paper. Simple. So if you're the negative, you know what you're going to say. Put it in your column on the 4-column sheet of paper. Why waste time doing it in prep time or trying to scramble to do it while the other person is speaking? That's silly. Do it before the debate happens. Preparation is the most important thing in debate. Next, 48 hours before you debate, you have to send your value and value criterion to your opponent. Don't send your definition. Don't send your cards. Just shoot an email. Yes, it has to be email that says, hey, my value is X. My value criterion is Y. That way we can have directed research. That way we know, it gives us a little bit of an idea of what our opponent's going to say so that the amount of research we need to do is not as big. Because remember, in the first negative speech, you have to make 2 arguments against the affirmative in addition to your own argument. Then, in the 1AR, the first affirmative rebuttal, you have to make 2 arguments against the negative and defend yourself against what the negative said. Or at least try. You don't have to be super successful, but you have to put in a very good faith effort. So this is why we're going to share just a little bit. Don't share any more. There's no need to overshare. Now, a warning. If your partner gets in contact with me and says, my opponent never gave me their value and value criterion, and you can't produce a time-stamped email that shows you did, I will take 20% off of the final LD grade for you. That's how serious I am about sharing. Just do it. All right? Not bad. I promise you it's a lot easier. Again, I know you have questions. For those of you that haven't asked me anything, I bet you have at least 3 questions. Ask me. Please, let me help you. Let me help you. Let me make this easier so you don't have as much anxiety about it. All right. Have a great day.